Hello, my name is Debbie Chen Pickler. Sign name is Deb. I work here at Gallaudet University in the Department of Linguistics. My teaching and research focus on three areas: language acquisition by deaf children who grow up in deaf families and are acquiring ASL, deaf families with coda children or deaf children, again from deaf families, who have cochlear implants. So they're similar in that they're acquiring both a spoken language and a sign language at the same time. And then thirdly, adults who are learning ASL as a second language. Today, we're going to be talking about language acquisition, what that process looks like, how it happens, what happens if it's delayed. We're going to break things down into four areas. First, we're going to show that natural human language is complex and it has many linguistic patterns. What does that exactly mean, to have linguistic patterns, and what kind of patterns are those? Babies are trained to notice those. Even though the patterns are quite complex, the baby's brain is able to find those patterns. Second, we're going to talk about that process of pattern finding for language acquisition and what happens when the input is either not high quality or it's delayed. The third point will be about bilingual acquisition. Bilingual input means that you have exposure to two different languages at the same time. And of course, the patterns then will be quite complex, but still the baby's brain is able to process that. And the fourth point, we'll be looking at deaf children from hearing families whose parents are having to learn sign language. There's a concern that they may not be able to sign well enough to benefit their deaf children, but we'll have a short discussion about various strategies that might improve the quality of that signed input. So the first point that we want to make sure we notice is that human natural languages have many different types of linguistic patterns. Those are complex patterns. They are sometimes difficult to see, but the baby's brain, once they are born, they're already able to recognize and look for those patterns. So those patterns exist whether or not the language is spoken or signed. It's important to explain very briefly about the different levels of language. Linguists will often talk about language acquisition in terms of different levels. So we have the phonological level, which is the level of form. In spoken languages, you have sound segments that combine together to make a word, or in sign languages, you have hand shapes, orientation, location, movement, which combine to form a word. And the lexicon, that's really talking about vocabulary, so how we learn vocabulary. The next level, morphology. Those are words that can be broken up into smaller parts, and each one of those parts contributes some meaning. So that applies to both sign languages and spoken languages too. Beyond that, we have syntax. At that level, we're mostly talking about word order. So the order of words in order to form sentences. Sign languages have their syntactic rules, and spoken languages have their syntactic rules as well. And then beyond that, even higher, we have the discourse level. And that's talking about multiple sentences, say, in a conversation or in a narrative, how those sentences connect with each other. I'll also talk very briefly about a rough timeline for language acquisition, L1. That really is surprisingly similar regardless of whether we're talking about acquisition of sign language or spoken languages. Even before you're born, it's possible that children are already learning language before they're even out of utero. But once they're born, they're immediately exposed to language, and they have to figure out the rules behind that language. Very early on, there is cooing, which we don't really consider linguistics. That's sort of breathing sounds, but not necessarily connected with language. A little bit after that, somewhere around 4 months, roughly, we have babbling. Babbling, again, doesn't have any meaning. It's not words. But we notice that you already can start to feel that there's some connection with the language of the environment. In spoken language, you have babbling. And in sign language, there's manual babbling as well. and they seem to be equivalent in function and form. Then we have the first word, which happens roughly around 1 year. And again, it doesn't matter if the child is learning a sign language or a spoken language, the first word comes in about that time. Then we have the first time that children put two words together to make simple sentences, and that happens roughly at 2 years. And beyond that, we have discourse development, which is more complex. So those milestones, very, very rough milestones, are averages, so we're not saying that all children follow exactly the same timeline. There's always a range of ages that's normal for each one of those milestones. So let's give an example of a linguistic pattern and how babies can recognize those patterns. When a baby is born and people begin talking with them or signing with them, they don't address them in individual words, they use full sentences. So the baby hears or sees strings of signs or words. The problem is the baby's job is to break that string up into individual words so that they can then connect those words with concepts and learn vocabulary. But how do they break up that string of input? How do they know where the boundaries are between one word and the next? Research on hearing babies so far has found that babies seem to use different types of cues to help them figure out where those boundaries are. One example is, imagine I have a sentence in English, "Don't break my glasses, Leah." The baby hears that sentence, and how is she going to know where the first word begins, the second word begins, and so on? Turns out there are 3 different types of cues or hints that babies use. They have some information related to intonation, the rhythm of English, as we speak. So we tend to have a falling intonation at the end of sentences when there's a period. And the baby knows that each time the voice falls, they can break the utterance there. So they can use that intonation and rhythm, otherwise known as prosodic information, to help them know where to segment the speech stream. The second type of cue that they have is the baby's own name or words that appear often that they've familiarized with. So in American culture, for instance, when we talk to the baby, we use the baby's name quite often. Leah, Leah, Leah. And the baby becomes used to that. So every time she hears a sentence with Leah in the middle, the baby knows that she can reliably cut the sentence before and after that word. And of course, it doesn't have to be a name. It can be words that are familiar, such as mother, father, dog. Those words that show up often in the input will help the baby know where to cut the stream. Another type of information, phonotactic information, which is just a fancy way to say phonological information, is also helpful. So by 2 or 3 months, the baby already knows that English has certain phonotactic patterns. They may notice, for instance, that in English, the sounds T and B hardly ever show up together in one word. English doesn't have any words that begin with that particular cluster, TB. That's an English phonotactic rule. So when the baby hears a string of sounds, don't, break, and there's a T and a B together there, the baby can guess that maybe there is a break between the T and the B, that those are separate words. And that's based on their knowledge of the fact that English doesn't have any words that begin with the cluster TB together. That's very complex phonological information. That's a phonological pattern that babies are able to recognize. Hearing parents may be willing to learn ASL, recognizing that that will be a lot of work. They may feel paranoid, wondering whether they'll ever be able to sign well enough to benefit their deaf children. Again, the research that we have so far on this is limited. But we do know that parents don't have to have a huge vocabulary and perfect grammar from the beginning. In the beginning, it's all right to sign in short sentences. The key aspect is how one signs, how one uses eye gaze, body movement. All of these things together accommodate a deaf child's needs. It doesn't matter if the vocabulary is limited or the grammar isn't actually perfect. So what are the big take-home questions from this webcast? First, all human languages have language patterns. They're complex patterns. Most people, if you ask them about these patterns, they wouldn't be able to answer you about what those look like. They require linguists with training and learning to figure out what these patterns are. But amazingly, babies' brains are already ready to notice and to find these patterns in the language input. If the input that the child receives is of high quality, the brain proceeds with this pattern finding with very little problem and establishes the rules of the language. But of course, this requires good and clear input. If that input is delayed, or if it's degraded in any way, the child doesn't have full access to it. For instance, we can speak terrific English to a child, and the patterns are very clear in that input, but if the baby's deaf and doesn't hear well, those patterns are lost to them. But if the input is not optimal, or if it's delayed, the result is a weak phonological foundation. A weak phonological foundation has impacts on other levels of linguistic processing: syntax, vocabulary, and discourse. All of those levels are impacted, and those impacts are permanent. They don't go away once the child has immersed themselves in a signing environment. Of course, they will sign, they communicate fine. However, the processing of the language is less smooth and less efficient than it could be. That impact is permanent, despite years and years of exposure to the language later. So that is a permanent effect of less effective language processing. How do we avoid that? With high quality input. Its importance simply can't be overstated.